Hi, my name is David Lindstrom. I am a doctoral candidate in sociocultural anthropology here at the University of California, San Diego. It's a beautiful day outside. I want to talk today about the purge and the counter-purge that are currently going on in U.S. higher education. And I'm inspired to talk about this by an editorial that came out today in the New York Times called The Authoritarian Endgame on Higher Education. And I'm just going to talk extemporaneously. I think I'm in a pretty good position to talk about it. I have 4 university degrees, 2 undergraduate degrees, 2 graduate degrees, actually 3 graduate degrees at this point. And I've been in higher ed for a quarter of a decade. And I want to situate what's going on here in terms of a larger history of authoritarianism in the world and the relationship between authoritarianism and bureaucracy. And I also want to bring in the history of the university, which is over 1,000 years old at this point. And I think that's important to explain how we got here. And what I want to do is frame what's going on here as a purge and a counter-purge. And people are talking about the counter-purge that's going on right now. And that is the withholding of large amounts of money to the universities by the Trump administration and the purging of particular language, often called DEI language from the universities. What's missing here is, and people also talk about authoritarianism clearly, what's missing here is an understanding of the original purge that took place in higher ed, which has been going on for at least 2 decades, as well as the reason why that purge was able to take place to begin with, which has to do with the governance of the university and how it's insulated from politics, or has been insulated from politics until quite recently. And that has to do with the 1,000-year history of the university. So this is an extemporaneous talk. I'm not exactly sure where it's going to take me, but let's jump in. So let's talk about authoritarianism in general. When you have an authoritarian governance, and this authoritarianism is governing a state that has a large amount of bureaucracy. And a good example for this would be Iraq before the United States invasion in 2003. What typically happens is that there is a single political party, and the political party has a particular ideology that's quite rigid, and demonstration of one's fealty to the party, either through speech acts or through actual card-carrying membership, becomes a requirement in order to advance within the bureaucracy. So, for example, in 2003 in Iraq, it was necessary to be a card-carrying member of the Ba'ath Party, B-A-T-H, capital B-A-T-H, in order to ascend within the bureaucracies of Iraq. And that could have been the medical system or clearly, the defense ministry. Any bureaucracy that had some kind of power, it was necessary to have membership in the Ba'ath Party. And the reason for this is, of course, quite straightforward. In an authoritarian regime, the bureaucracies create a lot of power. They manage a lot of power. They can manage hard power in terms of a War Department or a Defense Department. They can manage soft power through education, through the social production of human beings. And if one wants to maintain control over those bureaucracies over time, it's necessary to impose ideological fealty among those who join the bureaucracy. Otherwise, the bureaucracy could get out of control. So that's what happens in an authoritarian regime. And you could see this, in communist USSR. You saw this in communist China. It was necessary to be a card-carrying member of the party in order to advance within the bureaucracy. And at some points, it actually interfered with real science. This happened in the Soviet Union, where agricultural science was impeded for decades because Mendelian genetics was perceived as not being in line with Marxist orthodoxy. So that's briefly the relationship between an authoritarian regime and bureaucracy and party membership. So then the next thing to realize is that sometimes the head of the hierarchy within an authoritarian set of governances gets replaced, sometimes radically, by war, assassination. And when that happens, it becomes immediately necessary for the person that's at the top of the bureaucracy to purge the bureaucracy of the ideology of the previous authoritarian regime. Otherwise, the unreformed bureaucracy will pose a constant threat to the new regime, precisely because it'll be populated by individuals who are ideologically loyal to that prior regime. So you get a purge, and that purge can take place in a number of ways. It can be physical. You can physically kick people out of the bureaucracy. You can kill them. It can be ideological, where the old slogans that were used to demonstrate fealty to the prior regime are now outlawed and new slogans are instituted. And so it comes to be that purges and counter-purges are co-constituent with an authoritarian structure where the head of that structure is oscillating, is changing. So we saw a counter-purge in 2003 after the United States invaded Iraq. The administrator at the time, a person named Paul Bremer, instituted something called de-Baathification, which is exactly what it sounds like. The bureaucracies were purged of the former Baathists. And the idea was, well, the Baathism is authoritarian. By engaging in de-Baathification, we're going to get rid of it. The unanticipated consequence of that was that any person that had any skill in working within bureaucracies had to become a Baathist during Saddam's rule. And so when you purge the bureaucracies of all the Baathists, you purge the Iraq essentially, or the bureaucracies of Iraq, of anybody who's actually capable of running the bureaucracies. We might get back to that in a moment. Similarly, Stalin had purges when he came to power. Mao had purges when he came to power. Purges and counter-purges are part of authoritarianism. So, all right, so that's the relationship between, broadly speaking, bureaucracies, purges, ideologies, and changes of power at the top in autocratic regimes. So let's talk a little bit about the university. The university began in Catholic cathedral schools sometime in the 11th, 12th century. It was originally founded, I believe, the University of, is it Genoa? I want to say it was University of Genoa. It was in Italy. And then spread out quite quickly to England, actually, to Oxford, and then to Paris and to another number of other places. And it began as a medieval guild. So guilds started in the Middle Ages. We still have them. And guilds consist of professions where the members of that profession take charge of training new members of the profession and set requirements for full-scale membership. Usually there's tiers, right? Somebody who wants to enter a guild enters in as an apprentice. They can work for a while to become a journeyman. Eventually they become a master craftsman. And in the Middle Ages, there were a number of guilds. And that was the general structure that was set up. And the cathedral schools were no different. The cathedral schools originally had their goal to train priests. And because canon law and civil law were not as distinct as they are now, they soon came to train lawyers. And eventually they would come to train doctors. And of course, the original doctor was a doctor of the church. It wasn't a medical doctor. So that's why we have doctor being the highest level of attainment within the guild of academia, precisely because the original doctors were doctors of the church. And the purpose of a guild is to ensure a certain quality of skill and quality of morality among the practitioners of the particular profession. And along with that goes a certain amount of insularity from outside control. And this is by design. The idea of the guild is that the people that are most capable of determining whether or not a particular member has sufficient skills to be an expert in the guild and to practice it are in fact the people that are practicing it. And so there is a certain autonomy that guilds have traditionally had from the governments around them. So we can think about some guilds today. Maybe let's make this more concrete, for example. So psychologists, this is part of a guild, right? Medicine is a guild, electricians, plumbers. All of these guilds certify their own members and are given the responsibility by the state to certify their own members. So, for example, the state will deputize a particular medical organization, medical specialty, with the ability to accredit its own members. And the university was no different. And if you take a look at the way that the governances of universities are set up today, they are in some ways insulated from the churn of political movement within the executive and legislative branches. So, for example, here at the University of California, San Diego, which is part of the University of California system, the ultimate governing body for the university is the Board of Regents. And the Board of Regents does not answer directly to the governor. The governor is a member of the Board of Regents. So if you were to take a look at the power tree, you wouldn't find the University of California underneath the governor. It's not in the executive. It may technically be in the executive, but power-wise, the governor is merely a board member, and he has a great deal of influence. But the Board of Regents is a quasi-autonomous organization. And they are appointed by the governor, but they usually have very long terms. And so in some ways, it's like the Supreme Court. It's intended to be inured from political influence by means of a governing body that has individuals with long tenure and that ostensibly are at least put in their position for apolitical reasons. Okay, so that's the first part of the university I want to talk about, which was its governance structure that came out of the guild structure. We also want to take a look at the general philosophy of the university, because this is something that's changed. So the purpose of the university, again, originating out of its origins as in the cathedral schools, was to pursue truth. And originally, this truth was pursued by means of a process called scholasticism, which involved a very organized way of making arguments. And so it was an exercise in inculcating logic, and the premises upon which this logic operated were the theological foundations of the Catholic Church. And so scholasticism was intended to contribute to theology. But that's how it's originated. But the consequence of all of this disputation, this organized disputation that occurred communally within these guilds which gave birth to the university, was that logic itself was advanced. And people became used to the process of actually engaging in argumentation in a organized way, in a communal way, in a structured way. And so when the scientific revolution comes along with Galileo, it quickly becomes the case that those people that are interested in exploring the natural world empirically found a home within a community of scholars that were engaging in rigorous and structured argumentation. And so that's how the university and science comes together. The university predates what we would today call science. It was originally called natural theology, interestingly enough, again, showing the origination of the university within the Catholic Church. And so if you were to take a look at the mottos of many of these early universities, you will find that they mention truth, many of them. And the other thing that you'll see a lot is the word light, which of course is a metaphor in the New Testament for truth. Light is what gives us, as seeing beings, the truth about the structure of the natural world around us. Without light, there is darkness. And so light and darkness, light being representative of truth, and darkness being representative of ignorance, is a very common metaphor. And in fact, the motto of the University of California system is Lux et Veritas, light and truth, which is basically just saying truth and truth. So the universities were truth-seeking organizations predicated upon the organized disputation of theology. And then the scientific revolution happens. It becomes incorporated into the university under the rubric of natural theology, and eventually it continues to evolve and really move out of theology and then become a set of disciplines. First physics, and then chemistry, which emerges also out of alchemy, and biology, et cetera, et cetera. And then the social sciences come in really in the mid-19th, late 19th centuries. Anthropology gets really put on a foundation in the universities in the early 20th century. Okay, so let's bring together some of these strands. We have the university as a guild structure that's somewhat insulated from the comings and goings of the executive branch in the United States, as you know, because it's descended from the guilds and the medieval guilds. It was dedicated for the vast majority of existence, at least in theory, to the pursuit of truth. And as our understanding of the natural world expanded, it came to pursue truth, not primarily through theological argumentation, but through empiricism, which is to say, to use the physical senses. And this is the general structure of the university up until the 1960s. I'm debating whether or not to talk about anthropology. That seems to take us off track. Maybe I'll do that in another video. So, and it goes without saying that the universities, being as they were quite powerful bureaucracies, were largely inhabited by white men. Okay. And the universities were also responsible for the production and perpetuation of scientific racism. And scientific racism is the set of beliefs that claim that the human species is either directly composed of a set of subspecies or de facto composed of a set of subspecies, and that these species can be distinguished on the basis of differences in biology and consciousness. And scientific racism advanced the propositions that there were races that were more atavistic, that were less evolved, and in general, these races were supposed to be physically stronger, more closely related in a phylogenetic sense to other primates like chimpanzees and apes, and cognitively inferior. So that's scientific racism, and the university was involved in creating that ascientific and unempirical and unsubstantiated and damaging theory and set of theories. All right, so the 1960s happen, and the civil rights laws are passed, 64 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Act, Fair Housing Act. I want to say that's in 68. And there is a real push to increase the representation of individuals who are racialized as Black or African American, and racialized as Hispanic, and racialized as Asian in universities. So I want to say for a moment why I'm saying racialized as instead of saying Black and Asian and Hispanics. And the reason why is if we have this simple label, it can be easy to fall under the belief that there really are these groups that can be qualitatively distinguished from one another. In other words, that there really are groups of humans that one can find empirical tests to divide one from another. And these tests can take the form of biological tests or tests of consciousness. And consequently, that these are meaningful scientific social categories. And my perspective as an anthropologist is that's completely untrue. It's quite well established that race is not biologically meaningful as a set of discrete categories. There are no discrete categories of human beings on the basis of biology, which could then be given labels like black or white. That's quite well established. There's a variety of dimensions of human biological difference. They don't tend to map onto each other particularly well. They don't tend to cluster together in neat ways. And so they don't provide any kind of empirical support to the assertion that a set of discrete categories is useful for understanding the biological diversity of human beings. Now, there is another set of theories, which are sort of social and constructivist theories, which make the claim that because of historical and contemporary realities, these labels are nevertheless useful because they describe different forms of consciousness. And I don't know how many people would actually make that explicit claim, but that seems to be the de facto claim, the implicit claim behind many claims about race. I don't find that claim to be compelling either. If you try to do a factor analysis of beliefs or perceptions, which is to say, if you ask a bunch of people beliefs, a wide population of beliefs, or of questions, I should say, that pertain to belief and perception, and try to analyze whether particular answers to certain questions reliably predict answers to other questions. In other words, if you're trying to see if beliefs and perceptions can meaningfully cluster together, you will find clusterings, but I see no evidence, and I've seen no evidence that these clusterings map onto our categories of race. So I've seen no evidence that there is in fact a set of categories for consciousness that can be empirically supported. So this is why I say racialized as. Racialized as gestures to race as a process. It gestures to the fact that race is productively understood as a durable set of identifications. So, for example, if I were to say I am white, I'm not really saying that I'm not saying in a scientific sense that that I have a category of consciousness or biology that one could construe as qualitatively separate from someone who made the claim that I am black. What it is an identification. That's functionally what it is. It's a representation of the I and a category to which the I identifies. But it would be a mistake to construe that as in any way indicative that there are in fact categories of consciousness or categories of biology that one could associate with the racial categories. So when I say racialized as, I'm gesturing to the process of race, how race is created in individual instantiations. Okay, so there was a drive in the 1960s to increase the number of people who were racialized by themselves and by society as Black and Hispanic and Asian into the universities. And this was, I think, on moral grounds, a very laudable goal. And the problem, of course, was that the traditional criteria that were used to determine who could get admitted to the universities were being created through socialization institutions that largely excluded the individuals that were being targeted for increased inclusion in the universities. Hence this sense of affirmative action. I'm not going to get into affirmative action here, but that's essentially what we're talking about. Okay, so one other thing that happens in the 1960s is the recognition by a number of individuals that the university's choice, the choices of individuals within the university about which subjects to study were not apolitical, and that there were large swaths of human culture and belief and practice that were being under-examined. Or if they were being examined, they were being examined with a set of assumptions that might not be tenable. And it's from this social milieu that disciplines such as African American studies, women's studies, ethnic studies, that these emerge. Now, I don't think that the creation of these studies per se was a problem. Um, I don't know if anyone disputes the fact that the representations of women, the experiences of women were under-investigated within the university. I don't know of anyone who makes the claim that the experiences of individuals racialized as Black or African American um, was uh, was sufficiently represented. The problem originated in that many of the early founders of these disciplines explicitly rejected empiricism, and they embraced a different form of knowledge production, or I should say, different forms of knowledge production. And they did so, I think, largely on social and political grounds rather than epistemic ones. Epistemic ones meaning um, concerns that have to do with the discovery of truth per se. I say discovery of truth, not production of truth. We'll get to that in a moment. So, what epistemology, what philosophy of truth production did these individuals embrace? Well, it was a combination of Marxism and postmodernism. I think Marxism was attractive to these folks um, because it's explicitly an ideology of social change, purpose to improving the material conditions and ideological conditions, but I think principally the material conditions through changing the ideology of the lower class. Postmodernism was attractive because it's extraordinarily versatile. You can really use it to kind of gut any kind of knowledge that you don't like. You can semi-gut it, right? Like I don't think I think it gives people the appearance that you can gut and attack the production knowledge you don't like. So Marxism obviously starts with Karl Marx, and then is taken up in the Soviet Union. It's part of labor organizing in Europe and in the United States. Postmodernism comes along later. The flavor of postmodernism that's embraced by people in the U.S. Academy really comes from France, and is founded by people like Lacan and Derrida. And I've read all these folks. I don't recommend that you read them. And I think that these particular epistemologies, these philosophies for discovering truth, were adopted by people in ethnic studies and women's studies and later critical gender studies, not because they're good epistemologies, they're actually very bad epistemologies, but because they, in a phenomenological sense, in the sense of consciousness, are tools that allowed them to do what they wanted. And what they wanted to do was to take down a truth production system / epistemology that in some ways had been quite cruel to women and had been quite cruel to people racialized as African American and people racialized as Hispanic. This was absolutely accurate. Scientific racism was an awful thing. Um, the explicit, mostly implicit claims that women were intellectually inferior, this was unjustified, and it was socially destructive, and it was immoral. And these people were out to take a torch to it. These people were out to take a hatchet to it. The problem is that in trying to take this hatchet to this knowledge production system and epistemology that had in some ways been very unfair, was that the hatchet they picked up in the form of Marxism and postmodernism wasn't a good tool. It was good for destroying stuff. It wasn't any good for building things. So, in brief, this is a very brief summary. Marxism subdivides the human species into classes and creates a kind of class essentialism. So it replaces a race essentialism with a class essentialism, wherein there are certain classes that are supposed to be qualitatively distinct one from another. And this is very useful if you're trying to motivate social action by creating class solidarity, but it's not a very good means for knowledge production because, again, there are a wide varieties of human difference, which include the economic, and they don't break neatly down into discrete categories. starting to get sunburned, so I'm going to move over in the shade. Hope you stay with me. Postmodernism is, developed in a milieu of communism and Marxism within France, and so you can't really you can't neatly separate postmodernism from Marxism. But postmodernism builds on a seminal idea of Marxism, and the seminal idea of Marxism upon which it builds is that truth is produced. You may say in some sense it's discovered, but you also have to say that the rhetoric of truth is produced, and that it's produced within a political regime for the purposes of advancing the interests of certain actors and dissembling the interests of other actors. So Marxism takes this up. And I promise we're going to get back to bureaucracy and purge and counter-purge in a minute, but I got to take you through the story here. It takes that up, and it makes an absolutist claim from it. So it starts with the small claim that knowledge about economics and class that's being produced by the bourgeoisie, by the upper class, is really suspect and also not true, because it's not real truth, it's false truth. It produces false consciousness for the purposes of subordinating the proletariat. And it makes that claim about all truth and all power. So now it's not merely the claim that economic so-called truth is suspect. Now it's the claim that all truth is suspect, because all truth is serving a political end and is in some ways advancing the interests of some actors over others. Now, I said a moment ago that this is a bad epistemology, and the reason why is actually quite clear when you see it. If all truth is relative, if there really is no truth, if there's just power manifesting as truth, which is what Foucault would claim, as a later French writer, then the claim that all truth is nothing but an artifice of power is also merely an artifice of power. And so you can't be even sure of your original claim that truth is merely an artifice of power. The philosophy of postmodernism, when examined critically, ends up eating itself. It destroys itself. It undermines the basis by which you can make all truth claims. And this simple fact is hiding in plain sight. It's not difficult to see. I'm not the first person to point it out. Why don't the postmodernists recognize it? Well, they don't recognize it first because I think postmodernism is quite useful. Postmodernism is an attack dog that you can sick on your epistemological enemies, right? So you can take any particular set of claims, and if you want to undermine it, you just train a few postmodern theorists at them, sick Foucault on them, and suddenly you've shown that this isn't real truth because it's produced by this particular bureaucracy which has this particular interest, and therefore we shouldn't trust it, right? And so it's extraordinarily versatile in undermining the claims of people with whom one disagrees and claims that are inconvenient. So that's why it sticks around. The first reason it sticks around. The second reason it sticks around is that it's framed in an extraordinarily, how do I put it? The vocabulary is extremely abstruse. It's extremely arcane. The prose of these writers, especially somebody like Foucault, is extraordinarily dense and difficult to understand. And this complexity in terms of the stylistic aspects of this prose causes one to spend all of one's time trying to understand what Foucault or Derrida or one of these other cats is trying to say, and you're not spending much time on figuring out whether or not it's actually true. You're spending so many brain cells just trying to figure out what they're saying that you don't spend any actually distilling what they're saying down into kind of simple truth propositions that could be examined for whether or not they're internally coherent, which they're clearly not. There's also a social aspect to this, and that is that if you're in a graduate program and everybody's reading Foucault, and everybody's nodding and talking about how wise Foucault is, and how he really sees beneath the artifice of things down to what's really going on, there's a real social reason for you to nod your head too, because you want to be part of the group, and you want to be wise like he is, right? So there's a strong social conformity aspect to this as well. Okay, so coming back to these scholars in Black studies and ethnic studies and critical gender studies, they take up this philosophy that they largely get from France, which is a incongruent admixture of Foucault and Marxism. They don't really work well together. Postmodernism is busy destabilizing all truth, whereas Marxism is busy claiming I have the truth. You know, the grand narrative of history is really about the class struggle, while postmodernism is out there saying there is no meta narrative. So they don't work well together at all. But they work in a purely pragmatic sense, in the sense that these scholars are able to go out and do what they want to do. I'm not sure even they know what they're trying to do most of the time. So there's a big fight that happens in the 1960s and 1970s as these scholars are trying to get into the university. And there's a lot of pushback from more positivist disciplines like sociology and psychology. They don't want these folks in, but they get in. And what happens from then on is not a lot seems to be happening within the larger university. Throughout the 1970s, 80s, 90s, these folks that are writing over in these, I'm going to call them anti-positivist disciplines. So these are unempirical disciplines that are really not scientific. They often openly reject science, and they're really taking orientation which they call critical, which again is critical is from now on is just going to be a shorthand for postmodernism and neo-Marxism. They're kind of off in the background. They're producing their knowledge, but they're relatively small. They're relatively underfunded. They make a lot of noise, but they're kind of off to the side. And the university is still really dominated numerically, financially, by the positivists, by the people in the hard sciences, the physical sciences, the biological sciences. During this time, the humanities are atrophying. That is one thing that's happening. Okay, so that's what's going on. And as always, because the university still maintains this governance structure of a quasi-guild, it's relatively independent from politically what's going on. The social sciences and the humanities have always been heavily populated by leftists, but it used to be maybe a ratio of 1 to 5 leftists for 1 conservative. Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, has written about this. If you're interested in sort of the evolution of something like psychology from being a leftist majority discipline to a leftist-dominated discipline, you might want to take a look at his stuff. With a ratio of about 1 to 5, at least according to Haidt, the level of acceptable discourse was quite wide. Right? It was still sort of accepted to be a centrist or even a conservative in the humanities and social sciences. But over time, the percentage of conservatives and centrists decreased. And I think that was probably due to a slow march of incentives. And these are largely soft incentives, such as social approval, comfort, not really hard incentives or boundaries at this point that discouraged especially conservatives from pursuing the humanities and the social sciences. And these things were present even sort of in the early aughts when I was going to college for the first time. I'll give you a little background on me. I went to school for the first time in 1999 when I was a junior in high school. I got my bachelor's of science in biochemistry in 2005. I did the Peace Corps for 2 years. Went to Paraguay, learned Spanish and Guarani, came back, worked as a welfare caseworker for a little while. Got a second bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies in English, anthropology, and biology in 2011, something like that. Yeah. I did a master's of fine arts in creative writing, and then I started my PhD in sociocultural anthropology here at UC San Diego in 2018. So I have a background in the natural sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences, and I've been at the university for the last 25 years. So that's kind of on and off. So that's kind of how I have this kind of wide-ranging knowledge of all this stuff. Okay, so the next epochal moment happens in 2008. And I would say the universities are still a relatively pluralistic space in 2008. And what happens in 2008 is the Great Recession caused by the housing crisis. And in the wake of the Great Recession, the public universities are largely defunded. This is something that people don't talk a whole lot about, is that the universities were largely defunded in 2008 as a consequence of budget pressures at the state level. And after the economic recovery, they were not refunded. And the reason why is legislators figured out they didn't have to. The universities just raised their tuition. Potential students perceived that the universities were such an economic bargain that they were willing to take out loans in order to make it happen. The Department of Education facilitated the public defunding of education by making these loans available. That's an important point, right? If there wasn't a DOE that was making all kinds of Stafford grants and Perkins grants available to undergrads, it would have been impossible for these undergrads to continue to go to school at the increased cost of tuition. So the only way that the states were able to get away with defunding the universities was the Department of Education stepping in with these loans. And what happens in the wake of that defunding is a fundamental change in the incentivization of the universities. If you're trying to figure out where the values of a particular bureaucracy is going to come from, a really good place to start is to ask, well, where does the money come from? When the money comes from the public, the university, first of all, is in some ways beholden to the legislature because the legislature is signing the checks. But also, it has a vested interest in holding true to a larger set of public values. In 2008, when the universities were divested, the money started coming from students. And at larger universities like UCSD, where I'm at, it started to come from public-private partnerships. So the universities, and it took a while for the values and the practices of the universities to catch up with the incentives that have been set in 2008, they started to act less like old universities, the guild system, and they started to act more like businesses, with the students now construed more as clients. So a practice which embodies this new value system is the means by which teachers are presently evaluated at UC San Diego and most universities, which is to say the student evaluations. So student evaluations, at the end of every course, every student is asked to evaluate their teachers. And the guys here, the story that the university says is that the students are in some ways in a good position to evaluate teaching. They're not. We know on the basis of peer-reviewed studies that strong student teaching reviews positively correlate with high grades. So the best way to increase your student reviews is to inflate grades. And so you have rampant grade inflation and sort of the concomitant reduction in standards all across the university. That's what happens. And then you also have the university acting more as a job trainer than as an educator. Okay, so that's what happens in 2008. In 2008 as well, there's another big event, and that is the introduction of the iPhone. And you start to have a generation of young people that are raised on smartphones. And by the time they hit the universities 10 years later, 2015, 2016, 2017, you have a large cohort of young people that are much more anxious, much more depressed than people were before them. And again, Jonathan Haidt has written about this. I'll refer you to his work, Jonathan Haidt. By the way, I'm going to bring all this together. I'm going to bring the bureaucracy and the purge and the counter-purge back, but we're setting the sociological understanding for all this stuff. So these kids are just extraordinarily anxious, and I've been teaching during this time, right? And so I've seen the lowering of student preparation drastically. These are students that, for a variety of reasons, Haidt talks about it. I'm going to skip over that just because this is long enough. Generally more anxious, more depressed. They're not very good at solving their own problems. They are very poor time management skills. And they are caught up in the authoritarian moment and engaged in cancel culture. All right. Right around this time, you have the introduction of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm going to start speaking slower because I got to think this out a little better. So the first time I heard of DEI was in an education class. I briefly started a master's degree in education, then dropped out. DEI comes from the departments, the schools of education, in 2011, I think. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon. People think DEI has been around for a while, as it hasn't. I think it's just the last 15 years, really, and it's had any kind of impact. But it has its antecedents in these anti-positivist disciplines. That's where it comes from. And it has a very interesting history. So I'll say at the beginning that the words diversity and equity and inclusion sound really nice. They sound nice. The problem is that they're linked to a set of educational practices that are harmful for students and for the university in general. So let's take a look at each of these three terms, one by one. Diversity. The problem with diversity is you're not exactly sure what it means. And this is part of its use, right? It has a general affective connotation of being positive, but what exactly does it mean? It's hard to say. So when you have a pre-hire employment requirement, such as a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, or a contributions to diversity statement, you have no idea what it means on the outset. And so the people that require it can say that it's very open-ended, while at the same time concealing the fact that the criteria that will be used to judge this thing are extraordinarily exclusive and limiting. So equity. Equity, at least at first glance, is just a gloss for justice. It's the same thing. But the particular form of equity that takes place at the university is a conception of equity wherein students are treated differently on the basis of an ideology that sorts them into different categories for diversity. And this was actually how it was initially represented to me when I was in this class. And there's a particular picture that's often used to talk about equity, and it's these three individuals, and they're trying to watch a ball game. And equality is where there's a fence, right? And one individual can see over, and the next two are too short to see over. And then equity is where you have this fence, and the two shorter individuals are given boxes to stand on so that everybody can see the ball game. And it sounds very nice, right? Like, let's give everybody what they need to watch the ball game. Bureaucratically, I think it's a lot more complex than that. I would obviously be in favor of giving somebody an apple crate so they could watch a baseball game. I don't think anybody would, but would be against that. But how does that exactly work out in education, where you're trying to uphold high standards? How do you know whether the high standard is necessary because it's requiring the student to meet certain proficiencies which are necessary to go on to the next class, or whether those high standards are the metaphorical equivalent of you withholding the apple crate? There are a lot of people that come along and say, you're withholding the apple crate. And it's a very emotional appeal, especially if it's an appeal that's made on the grounds of trying to combat racism. The problem is it occurs in a context where, as I said before, people are incentivized anyway to lower standards because the university has been turned into a client-centered organization rather than a student-centered organization. It treats students as clients rather than students as students. And inclusion, like diversity, is similarly amorphous. And the other problem is that a message that's going to be perceived as inclusive to some people will be perceived as exclusive to others, right? So if you were to make a claim to people of a particular political persuasion, I'm with you politically, that's going to be perceived as inclusive by those individuals who are so politically inclined. And it's going to be perceived as exclusive to individuals who are not politically inclined. So again, it has a completely amorphous meaning, ambiguous meaning. Well, what does this ambiguity actually signify in practice? Well, from the ground level, from the perspective of someone inside the university, what it's usually constituent with is a lowering of standards on the basis of racial equity, which just happens to be what's in the best interests of teachers that want to goose their grades, goose their student evaluations, and is in the interest of the university in terms of increasing retention. Right? It conveniently happens that being racially inclusive is the very thing that allows the universities to up retention and allows teachers to get positive reviews. But is it in the best interest of students? I doubt it. So it happens to be and this is worked out at the University of California, San Diego. There is currently a freshman preparatory writing program, and I'm not joking about this, that legitimized making every assignment have a floor of 50%. In other words, you get a 50% on every assignment, irrespective of whether you turn it in, and eliminating late penalties on the grounds that this was socially just. So DEI has corresponded to a drastic reduction in standards. That's the equity portion. And the inclusion portion has corresponded to a taking over of the university of messaging from political leftism. And there are a variety of ways that this works out bureaucratically. So I'm going to try to talk about contemporary UCSD and the ways in which this has worked. And I'm going to bring this back to the purge and counter-purge in a moment. Here at UCSD, we have an actual vice chancellor of diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, this is an individual that doesn't oversee any academics, doesn't oversee any scholars, oversees no research, oversees no teaching, right? Doesn't oversee student affairs. This is essentially a vice chancellor who makes, last time I checked, about $350,000 a year, which is only $100,000 a year less than the vice chancellor that oversees all the academics. That has like thousands of people working for him. I think this vice chancellor oversees maybe 10 full-time employees. Again, this is a vice chancellor. This is like right underneath the chancellor. 10 full-time employees making $350,000 a year, overseeing no academics, no research, no students. All they do is produce ideology. So we have a vice chancellor of ideological production here at UCSD. And they are involved in the production of basically leftist political ideology. We have a hiring system at UCSD where there is rampant systemic discrimination on the basis of hiring. This is an open secret. So there's widespread production of ideology at the university. There is systemic breakings of law. And this is undergirded by hold on, I'm going to pause it for a moment. All right, and there's two other things that I'll mention. And the first is explicit discrimination on the basis of ideology in hiring. So in order to be hired for an academic position, a tenure-track position at UC San Diego, you have to submit something called the Contributions to Diversity Statement, which is a de facto representation that one is in alignment with the ideology of race and social justice present among leftists at the university. And again, the people who will require this will say that it's open-ended. It's not. It's not. You can go to the UC San Diego website. You can see sample examples of successful contributions to diversity statement, and they're all saying the same thing. It's not open-ended. It's basically a requirement that an applicant demonstrate their membership in the political party. And then the second thing, and this is actually quite recent, this was instituted during the Biden administration, is that it became necessary to demonstrate one's ideology, one's ideological fealty, in order to receive grant funding for both the Department of Energy and the National Institutes of Health. So the Biden administration published guidance which clearly made the claim that one had to demonstrate in the grant materials, again, ideological fealty to leftist politics in order to get grant funding. And so you had all of these mechanisms that came into play, from the production of ideology in an entire organization that's devoted to producing ideology, right? The associate vice chancellor and the people under that person for DEI. You had rampant discrimination in hiring on the basis of race and also on political ideology. And you had discrimination for research. And this ideological takeover of the university by the left, now we're going to come back to governance, right? It happened because the university was relatively insulated as a guild from the churning of politics at the top. And it happened because the university was weakened financially by the divestment from education that took place in 2008. And became less representative, less responsive to the desires of the people. So all of this constitutes what I would call the soft purge of the university. It took place over time. It took a couple of decades. But the university was, within the administration, within the humanities, and within the social sciences, systematically purged of individuals that were willing to openly espouse anything other than leftist politics. And within the natural sciences, eventually, that came to happen as well. And there are certainly centrists and conservatives in the natural sciences, but people have to keep their mouth shut. So then what happened? Well, you had a change from the Biden administration, which acted in an authoritarian manner to institute ideological requirements for grant funding, to an authoritarian Trump administration, which recognized that the bureaucracies of the university, which are very powerful bureaucracies, were essentially controlled by individuals of the opposite party. And just like Stalin did when he came to power, and just like Mao did, and just like the US did in Iraq, we now have a counter-purge going on, where the iconography and the slogans of the prior quasi-authoritarian regime. I'm not suggesting that Biden is equal authoritarian as Trump. I'm just saying that this was an authoritarian governance with respect to education. The slogans and the iconography of the past regime are now verboten, and they're going to be replaced with the new ones. And I've gone over a lot of particularities here, but that's the larger context. Understand, this was a bureaucracy, this set of universities that were largely insulated from political power at the top, that were taken over by authoritarian folks of a particular political persuasion. We happen to call them leftist. It happened for a variety of historically contingent reasons. The philosophy per se has its grounds in Marxism and postmodernism. It espouses a race essentialism that is in turn descended from a class essentialism of Marxism, but then sort of inflected with a postmodernism critique of positivist epistemology. And was put in place, was allowed to flourish because the university as a body was weakened by divestment, post-2008 recession, and by an influx of, for lack of a better word, large numbers of hysterical students and feckless administrators. And that was the soft purge. And now we've got the hard purge. We've got the purge that's very rapid, that involves the divestment of a lot of money. Where to go from here? I think we got to stop both purges. That's the thing. We need to return the university. I don't want to sound like things were better back in the days, but they were better in the 90s at the university. We need to return the university to a pluralistic space that is dedicated to the pursuit of truth, not the pursuit of politics, that has substantial public support and public accountability. I don't know if the guild system can work at this point. I think at this point, political actors may need to take control of these public universities. Now, that risks authoritarianism from the top, but I don't see that that's any worse than authoritarianism from people that aren't elected. We might need to have some control being reasserted by the executive. And then if the university cleans up its house, then it can go back to being a guild structure. What might need to happen, I think, is a grand bargain between the university and politicians. I think the university's got to go to the politicians and say, we screwed up. We let ourselves be taken over by a bunch of bad actors that weren't acting in the best interest of the university or their students. And we want to work with you to reform ourselves. We need the support of the public. We've lost our legitimacy, and we need your support. And I think when that representation has been made, there might be some room for an additional representation, which is for the universities to say to the politicians, hey, you need us too. Yeah, we've produced a bunch of crap knowledge out of these grievance studies, but we produce a lot of good knowledge. We do a lot of important research in biology and physics and chemistry, and there's still some good research going on in psychology. Honestly, I think anthropology is probably a discipline that should be left to die. I know it sounds a strange thing as someone who was getting his PhD in anthropology, but I think it's largely been taken over by a bunch of folks that aren't really interested in science or truth, and they're just interested in taking the resources of the discipline and using it for their own political ends. But so I think this grand bargain needs to be struck between the university and the politicians. And I'll close by talking about the real victims here in all this, and sort of the victims that I see day to day. And the victims in this whole process, the victims of the soft purge, the victims of the hard counter-purge, are the students. So UCSD has a series of classes called diversity, equity, and inclusion classes. And these are classes that each student is required to take. A student has to take at least one diversity, equity, and inclusion class. And many different departments offer them. And here's how they work in a structural sense. You get an underpaid adjunct to teach a lecture of 300 people with maybe 3 graduate TAs. The department does not oversee the course. the lecturer gets to lecture on whatever they want. The students pay a bunch of money. The department rakes in a bunch of money. And then the students go their own way. And as a consequence of the lack of oversight and the ideological takeover of the university and the low standards and the fact that these students are not in the major, they're just taking a course. These are the worst courses I have ever seen taught at a university anywhere. These courses are almost pure indoctrination. These students are being forced to hand over their good tuition money to sit through a quarter of ideological indoctrination and race essentialism, race and class essentialism. And these courses are nominally not race essentialist, but de facto, human beings are treated as a set of discrete consciousnesses that map onto racial categories. The students are the victims in this. So, in sum, in order to get out of this cycle of purge and counter-purge, I think we need to change the university governance structure from being a guild to something that's more accountable, which the university is going to hate, by the way. The university is going to claim that this is making it susceptible to authoritarianism. And yes, it is. But it's already subject to authoritarian purges and counter-purges. And it's lost legitimacy among the public. So this is something that needs to be worked out with the public, not keeping the public out. And the only way to do that is to make the universities more accountable to the people and more accountable to elected officials. So we need to temporarily set aside the guild structure, or at least weaken it, make the universities more accountable to the public, set out a grand bargain where the universities agree to get rid of the bureaucracies that are doing nothing but produce ideology. They have to agree to uniformly enforce federal anti-discrimination laws, not just nominally, but substantively. And in turn, the legislatures need to commit to refunding the universities so that the economic structures incentivize the right value system and practices. That's the way forward here. All right, that's it. That's the 1,000-year history of the university and the influence of postmodernism and Marxism and the tug of war and the purge and the counter-purge. And that's all I got to say. So hope you enjoyed it.